Okay, class, here we are. We now want to talk about the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, we had just finished doing the loop of Henle, so now we want to make some comments on the distal convoluted tubule. Now, your text doesn't have this, but I'm saying the distal convoluted tubule is divided into a proximal portion, which is the portion closest to the loop of Henle, and a very distal portion. The very distal portion leading into the connecting tubules. Connecting tubules actually what connect to the collecting duct. These tubules have receptors for ADH and aldosterone. Okay, we will examine the proximal portion. All right. The proximal portion of the distal has three regions: the pars recta, pars convoluta, and a pars, and in between there's something called the macula densa, a dense spot of cells. We're going to talk about this a little later when we talk about something called the juxtaglomerular apparatus, the juxtaglomerular. So keep this in mind and we'll come back to that. All right. The DCT, distal cells, are short cuboidal cells. Let's go back to something here we can find. So these would be short cuboidal cells there. Those right there. DCT is not permeable to water or urea. It has sodium chloride sympoters in the apical portion. Thus, more sodium and chloride are absorbed. In the basolateral, we have our sodium-potassium pump. Also, we have chloride leak channels. Parathyroid hormone can control calcium. So I'm going to come to something now as we look at this, but I want you to read on it. All right, that's loop of Henle. All right, the distal convoluted tubule. Let's look at what I have here. There is some automatic removal of solute, particularly the electrolyte sodium and chloride. So there is some automatic removal of solute in the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, let's go back. But let's say the tubule is fairly impermeable to most solutes, unless hormones make it permeable to these certain solutes. The buzzword I'm going to say is fine-tuning of solute concentrations. Let me say it again. Fine-tuning of solute concentrations. This fine-tuning means that the amounts of electrolytes reabsorbed is now under homeostatic influences. How much is reabsorbed, which means retained by the body, is how much is needed to maintain the proper blood level of the particular electrolyte. See, the first areas, particularly the proximal convoluted tubule, was gross reabsorption. We had to bring that back. We'd have been dead. Then we brought some more back in the loop of Henle, some of which we needed back or we'd be dead. But now we're down to a level where if we lost everything, we could kind of still make it. So now we're down to fine-tuning, only bringing that stuff back that we absolutely need to bring back for homeostasis. Okay, let's go here. What hormones are of interest when discussing the distal convoluted tubule? Okay, what hormones are of interest? Put a question mark there. Okay, aldosterone is a hormone for sodium and potassium. Aldosterone is nicknamed the sodium retaining hormone. We'll be talking about that. Antidiuretic, we actually have talked about this before in the blood vessel chapter. Antidiuretic hormone, we talked about it before in the blood vessel chapter. It is for water in its effort to maintain proper blood osmotic pressure. We'll be talking about that. And then parathyroid hormone for calcium. That's kind of an ANP1 deal there. So we go further. There are two special epithelial cells interspersed in the latter parts of the DCT. The principal cells, which have the receptors for hormones, and the intercalated cells, which have to do with acid-base balance. Okay, so let's go further here. See what we got. Okay, as fluid flows through the distal convoluted tubule, reabsorption of sodium and chloride continues due to sodium chloride sympoters. They're being resorbed because you have that sodium-potassium pump in the back. So that sodium-potassium pump is what actually does that. All right, see, I don't really have a good picture of DCT action. The DCT serves as a major site where parathyroid hormone causes reabsorption of calcium. If you go back to my NP1, parathyroid hormone is the main hormone for calcium balance in the body. DCT is not permeable to water because it does not have committed aquaporins, but it could have those if necessary. And what would bring those in is antidiuretic hormone. Now let's look at what we have here. Filtrate amounts entering the DCT, which means the filtrate amounts that would be entering after it's gone through the proximal convoluted tubule and the loop of Henle. 20% of original filtrate of water, 15% to 25% of potassium, 5 to 10% of sodium, 5% of chloride. And you can see these particular numbers. So these numbers can kind of be for fine tuning. A little bit too much potassium needs to be brought back, but fine tuning time. Okay. The connecting tubules, which you probably don't have in your text, these are the tubules that the DCT goes into before it goes into the collecting duct. And this is really more, so this is actually part of the distal convoluted tubule in a way. And this is where you have the principal cells and the intercalated cells that I want you to read on. Okay? The intercalated cells, there are two kinds, a type A and B, and their job is to maintain acid-base balance. The principal cells are cuboidal cells, and they have receptors for both antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone. Antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone. Okay? So the principal cells, which are located in the distal convoluted tubule, okay, the DCT connect and collect are normally impermeable to water. They have no aquaporins. However, when stimulated by antidiuretic hormone, they can carry in tiny membrane-bound vesicles containing aquaporins 2. See, aquaporins 1 are the permanent ones. Okay, aquaporins 2 are considered facultative, which basically means they come in under homeostatic balance. So the proximal convoluted tubule and the descending limb of the loop of Henle had aquaporins 1. They were permanent residents. Aquaporins 2 are not permanent residents. They are brought in by homeostasis. The vesicles fuse with the cell membrane, introducing aquaporins 2 into the cell of the principal, thus opening channels for reabsorption of water. So my point is that the distal convoluted tubule does not reabsorb water unless aquaporins 2. And to get to aquaporins 2, antidiuretic hormone must be released. Now remember, antidiuretic hormone, when we did the blood vessel chapter, is produced by the posterior pituitary in accordance with osmotic balance. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about osmotic a little later. Okay, aldosterone also works on the principal cells. It stimulates them to insert sodium-potassium exchangers. So here's kind of the way to say this. Aldosterone causes the body to retain sodium while it kicks out potassium. Aldosterone causes the body to retain sodium. So it's called the sodium retaining hormone, but at the same time, you lose potassium. Sodium retention, but you lose potassium. Okay? And that aldosterone works on the principal cells. What controls the aldosterone? Well, remember many things. One was the renin-angiotensin, but the other was the level of potassium and sodium in the body. In other words, if the sodium level gets low, aldosterone is secreted. If the potassium level gets high, aldosterone is secreted it gets high in the blood. Okay. So the principal cells, sodium enters through leakage channels. You can see like here, these are the principal cells, but these work if what? Aldosterone is present. If aldosterone is present. So I want you to read on that in the text. Then we get to the collecting duct. I'm going to make another video. So let's see what we have. The distal convoluted tubule comes after the loop of Henle. The distal convoluted tubule, let's go back to our deal. The distal convoluted tubule has a little bit of automatic removal of sodium and chloride. A little bit of sodium and chloride, because what has happened is what entered there, let's see if we can find it. What entered there was sodium about 5 to 15% and chloride about. So some of this is reabsorbed in the DCT. But most of the solute is impermeable to unless these hormones come in. Okay? And the hormones are under homeostasis, bringing this back only if it's needed. So then the hormones of interest again are primarily aldosterone and ADH, a little bit of parathyroid hormone for calcium. And the cells that we see are the principal cells and the intercalated cells. Intercalated cells, there are two kinds, intercalated A, intercalated B, and then the principal cells are the ones that have receptors for aldosterone and ADH. So that kind of gives you an idea to get you going, and then once you read it in the text, you'll get a better understanding. So that then brings us to the collecting duct, and we'll start a separate video on the collecting duct.